Hello YouTube, Blue Cat here with a new camera angle and the review for Final Fantasy Type 0 HD remake for Xbox One. This is the final part of that review series and will be the actual review of the game where I give it a score. I'm going to start off talking about the graphics for the game and then go into gameplay, the plot, the sound a little bit, and then how I overall felt all of that came together to make the game. So for the graphics, the visual style that they're going for is really good in my opinion. It is definitely intriguing and interesting and just holds your attention. With Militesi Empire being a very militaristic, World War II-esque look to it, I believe, is really the vibe that I'm getting from it and the vibe that I think that they were going for. Rubrum has a very regal, academic look, obviously with the capital being Academia, Class 0. It already had a school vibe going for it, and that even looks really intriguing. And then finally, Concordia, which has sort of a traditional Final Fantasy Dragon Knights look to it, and all of those styles sort of come together with the world design to make it all feel like it really fits together really well and could all exist in the same place. So that is really good there. The graphics, as a result of it being a port and not a complete overhaul system, it definitely doesn't stand up to the same quality as a typical next-gen console game. However, it is very serviceable. The main issue I had with the graphics being the lighting during the pre-CG cutscenes. There's a soft light blue hue to the graphics that looks very good. It smooths everything out, makes it really appealing and pretty to look at. However, during the actual gameplay segments, they choose for a more red hue based lighting, or at least that is what it looks like to me. It may be a different color, but that choice makes a lot of the analyzing and stuff like that, the angles, stand out really heavily, and that sort of ruins the effect of how the art is intended to look. It also affects the colors in some way just because it's such a harsh lighting and such a contrast creating lighting effect. But overall, the graphics are just serviceable. There's nothing really all that special about them. Sometimes, other than that, the design really, in and of itself, is attractive. And that sort of is a reoccurring theme with everything that I'm probably going to say about this game, is that the design that went into the concept that is Final Fantasy Type 0 is pretty good. It's really interesting and all that, but the execution isn't, at least for us, that great. I think there were issues with localizing, issues with the port, stuff like that. But there are issues even before that point that I'll get to as I get towards the plot. But for the gameplay, it's probably the standout feature of the game. It's sort of a tactical hack and slash style action RPG, and the action itself is very, I was going to say like thought requiring, but more just that it feels very fluid and allows for a lot of choices, and when you mess up you feel like it's because you made a poor choice rather than the cheapness of the game, with the exception of the lock-on system. The lock-on system doesn't really grab who it should all of the time. Sometimes you'll be looking at an enemy, activate your lock-on and pull the screen behind you, or even once it's locked onto that person behind you, you won't be able to switch it over with the analog stick to the person that you were intending on targeting. And for the few fights where you have to target a specific target to really succeed in the battle, this is particularly an issue because usually the enemies are very close together and it won't jump over to the enemy that you need to be attacking. But like I said, the overall concept of the gameplay works very well, and the controls work very well with the exception of the lock-on. Then getting into the plot, this is probably where Final Fantasy Type 0 is at its weakest, and that's kind of disappointing because Final Fantasy games usually stand out for not necessarily their plot, but just their storytelling and things like that. This one, however, due to localization issues, the dialogue isn't all there. Characters don't say complete sentences. They don't get their ideas across in a concise or even realistic way for someone who speaks English as their primary language. It sounds more like someone is speaking English as their second language for a lot of these characters. Rim being the worst example, with her often repeating the first couple words of her sentence again at the end of her sentence. Other characters have better voice acting and better written dialogue, but overall the dialogue is very empty spaced in that it doesn't really explain what's going on. You're given a lot of context through cutscenes that have sort of a military documentary vibe, but you aren't given any explanation for the events that you're currently undertaking. Clock Zero itself doesn't get a whole lot of plot until the very last mission, which sort of comes out of nowhere unless you play through the game a second time, repeating a lot of the same missions that you've previously gone through, with the addition of a few new ones filling out some of that story. Their story being that weak, especially considering Ace is supposedly the main protagonist of the game, while Rim and Machina receiving a lot of attention, almost to the point where they seem more the focus of the plot. Reminds me of another Final Fantasy game that I felt sort of dropped the ball in storytelling. I can't really remember which Final Fantasy that was, but I'm sure it'll come to me. And I'm sure before that little flash there, everyone knew more or less what I was talking about with the previous protagonist switcheroo and the Final Fantasy main series. But their story is fairly interesting. Other than Rim's tendency to say the beginning of the sentence at the end of the sentence, Machina and Ace have some of the best voice actors and some of the best dialogue. Machina tends to be a little bit too angsty for my taste, but I'm sure there are people out there that really love that character. Ace probably is my favorite character of those three. He just doesn't receive a whole lot of attention, except for, again, a little bit more in the second playthrough. So overall, with the story, it just doesn't feel focused. It feels very empty. I can't even really recommend playing through the game a second time after you've spent 30 to 40 hours on the first playthrough and are about to spend another 20 or so hours repeating those missions, in addition to the few, maybe 5 to 10 hours of new missions. And even less of that is actually pertinent to the story. It's probably maybe 2 hours of missions that are really pertinent to the story, at least that I found. On my second playthrough, other people may vary. And then finally, getting into the sound design of Final Fantasy Type 0 HD. The music's really good. The little Bump of Chicken theme song that comes up a few times in the Death Hymn that comes up a few times are really intriguing. The overworld music when you're on the Chocobo is like a lighthearted, fun tune. It's all pretty good for setting the mood once again, the voice acting is not very quality, just in the delivery of the performances, not so much the words. That is what I'm referring to this time. It doesn't feel professional at all how they're really saying things. So, Final Fantasy Type 0 HD is a really serviceable game. It doesn't stand out in my mind for any particular reason. The gameplay is good, but it is just, or not, it's not even really that good. It's just solid. It works at doing what it set out to do. I originally was feeling a 6 on this, but really thinking about it again as I was talking to you all about it, I feel it really is more of a 5. It's really middle of the road for gaming, and on the Xbox One and the next generation consoles in general, I found that they aren't really pushing a whole lot of boundaries with most of these games. A few have stood out, and at some point I hope a good few more will stand out, but right now that's not really the case in my opinion, although there's a much bigger I guess just service in the indie department right now with the downloadable games for both consoles really standing out to me more than the AAA box titles. But that is really a topic for another video. So just how did you feel about the game, honestly? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Best Final Fantasy game in the series, worst Final Fantasy game in the series, also middle of the road Final Fantasy game in the series, most forgettable Final Fantasy game in the series? Comment below, let me know. If you like this video, like, subscribe, help me out. Keep on keeping on, happy people. And this is Blue Cat signing out.